we can do that, but thanks to technology, we're able to provide this opportunity for people around the world. And we are, we're able to do these talks from Zoom. So if anybody, I'm sure some of you have heard Holocaust survivors speak before, it's a unique opportunity. You're really the last generation that will have the opportunity to interact with the Holocaust survivor, to listen to their stories firsthand. And then you'll be able to ask questions. So again, I'll remind everyone before we start again, but there's a Q&A box that some of you I see are already using. You can type in questions in that box when, if you have a question, you can wait till the end or during, whichever however you like to do it. And again, this is just a really important opportunity for you, because you one day will get to tell your children that you had the opportunity to listen to a firsthand account of this time in our history. And for those of you who might have been to our museum before, we're a small museum that was founded by Holocaust survivors. In fact, we are the first Holocaust museum in the United States that was built by survivors. And so the story is that survivors came from Europe to LA in the 60s, and it's a small group of about a dozen of them who decided they wanted to create some sort of memorial for their family who had perished. And what they did after work, they would meet in each other's homes and different offices, and they worked for decades to build a memorial. And essentially what they came up with was the museum that we have today. Think about this. Their goal was to make sure that this was never forgotten, which is why they worked so hard to build this museum. Even now, when we're not physically able to go into this space and to go into the museum that they spent such a long time building, we're still carrying out our mission. Our mission is to commemorate, educate, and inspire. And we are able to still do that now thanks to technology, and of course to our volunteers like Paul, who you'll meet momentarily, who's willing to share his story with you. We have just a couple more minutes. For the teachers who are currently in the chat, if you could just tell me briefly, just type it into the chat, just what your students have already studied about the Holocaust. Whether you might have read some books or studied it. And I know we have a history class here as well, so we'll see. Okay. So we have one of the teachers, Lisa Liss from Sacramento, who says her students have studied it extensively already, and she thanks you for joining, Paul. And Monica Ponce says, we have covered the Nazi ideology that led up to it. And look, final teacher, I apologize if I mispronounced her name, Arceli Kester says in her world history class, her students just finished 2 weeks of the stages of the Holocaust from the 1930s through the Nuremberg trials. So I think this is a good time to start. We have about 45 students so far, so we thank you so much for attending. 46 people are still trickling in for just a little bit, so I'll just give a quick introduction. It seems like these students have studied the Holocaust in pretty extensive detail, starting in the earliest days from Germany in the 20s and 30s, which is really helpful to understand Paul's story, as you'll see. So welcome everybody to our program. For those of you who weren't here a few minutes ago when I gave an introduction, I'm just quickly, I'm from Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. We're the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States, built by survivors, and our mission is to commemorate, educate, and inspire. And for those of you who are here, we have a very special opportunity for you. You get to listen to Paul Kester, a Holocaust survivor from Germany, who will share his story with you. And afterwards, you will have the opportunity to ask him questions. And what you can do is you can type them into the Q&A box, either during or if you want to wait till after, you can do that. So Paul, we are so happy and honored to have you here. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. And thank you, Paul.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. It's, for me, a new experience to talk to a machine rather than a live audience. You can see me, I cannot see you, so I don't know what your facial expressions are, what you look like. It's something that I miss, but we make the best of it, and I better get started. Who am I? What am I? I am a member of a tiny minority, a rapidly disappearing minority of Jewish children born in Europe during the years after the First World War, the 1920s and 1930s, who were still alive at the end of World War II in 1945. You have studied and know about the Holocaust. You know that 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Included in the 6 million were 1.5 million children. I knew quite a few of them, but I was not one of them. I was lucky. So let me tell you my story, how I did not become one of the 1.5 million, but one of the few thousand who survived, who got out of Germany or wherever they were born and managed to survive the era and start new lives, new normal lives after it all had passed. I was born in 1925 in a town called Wiesbaden in Western Germany, near Frankfurt. If any of you ever have traveled or will travel to Germany, chances are you will land in Frankfurt, which has the main airport of Germany. Wiesbaden was a town of about 300,000 citizens. Half of the population were Catholic, half were Protestant. But there was also a small Jewish community of 3,000 Jews, roughly 1% of the population. Now in 1933, before Hitler came to power, in all of Germany had a population of 65 million citizens. And there were 600,000 Jews among them. Again, barely 1%. Now, my earliest memories go back to the 20s, not the 20s we live in now, but the 1920s. As I mentioned, I was born in 1925, and in a family of parents, I had a 2-year older sister, grandparents, large family of relatives, uncles, aunts, cousins. And I had a good, easy, pleasant childhood. I have good memories, even though those early years in the late 20s and early 30s were very difficult economic times. Those were the years of the Great Depression, which we had in this country, but also in Germany, very high unemployment. And I remember during those early years, whereas we were kind of middle class, the family had a clothing store in town and managed to lead what we would call lower middle class life. We children did not suffer, but I remember that beggars came to the house asking for pennies or bread. I remember the large signs of empty apartment buildings. I remember the political unrest and political propaganda done by different parties, socialists, communists, liberals, you name it, all trying to get votes and take power. The National Socialists, or as we call them now, the Nazis, were what became, during those difficult times, one of the major parties, and ultimately, in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and very quickly, the Nazis took complete power and established a dictatorship. For those who were opposed, they either had to leave the country or keep quiet. And if they still were active in politics, they ran the risk of getting arrested and sent to concentration camps. Now, what I remember I started school in 1932, 6 years old, elementary school. And what I remember in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, they put up big signs all over town. And what it said on those signs, it said, "The Jews are our misfortune. The Jews are criminals. The Jews caused the fact that that Germany lost the First World War." And other slogans depicting the Jews as the scum of the earth. Now, for me, this was difficult to understand. My parents, my grandparents, the relatives and friends that I knew that they were not criminals. So I could not quite cope with the official slogans that were all over town. And the surroundings, the family where I grew up and where I, during those early years, had a happy and normal childhood. Now, when I started school and when the Nazis came to power, I did not suffer any hardship. Teachers and students treated me, I was the only Jewish child in class, as any other, as all the other children. And I don't recall any attacks or mistreatment from the other boys. They and I were too young to really understand this ideology that the Nazis pursued, where they blamed the Jews for whatever had been wrong during difficult years leading up to the time when they took power. Yes, some of the relatives and friends of the Jewish community started talking that maybe one should leave Germany. As a matter of fact, two of my cousins in the early 20s, they were older, did leave since they realized one had to leave, was expelled from the university where he studied. The other from the work was where he had been employed. So they were young and single and had no family responsibilities. They left the country and built new existences in overseas. For us, for my family, to leave Germany, where we had been, where the family could trace its family tree back to the 1400s, in other words, 500 or 600 years back in time. They always had lived in West Germany, and before the Nazis came to power, had been part of society, been accepted, and were pretty much assimilated. For me, at the time, I could see no difference between me and others, except where my fellow students went to church or had religious education, either in the Catholic or Protestant faith. I would get religious education in the Jewish community, in the Jewish, and would go for services. Instead of a church, I would go to a synagogue. I'm talking about what it must have been for the grown-ups. In retrospect, I can only imagine. I know that my grandmother, who was active in the business when she came to work in the mornings, would be greeted by a neighbor across the street, always friendly, always in a good neighborly fashion. But all of a sudden, after 1933, that neighbor would ignore and no longer greet my grandmother. It must have been quite a shock to all of a sudden be dismissed as an enemy of the country and no longer be part of the general society. My grandfather had been quite active in city government. Of course, those jobs he lost. He did die in the spring of 1935. So he did not, he was spared what was going to happen in the years to come. In 1936, I had finished 4 years of elementary school, and it was now a question of starting, should I go to high school? And if so, which one? At the age of 10, one had to decide if one wanted to go to a gymnasium, a high school, which ultimately would, after 8 years, would give you the opportunity to pursue college or university studies, or you could continue what's called the non-academic school until the age of 14 or 15, at which time you would start an apprenticeship to learn a trade or whatever you decided. I was a good student, and my family wanted me to go to the gymnasium. I had to pass an entrance exam. That was no problem. I passed that easily. And so my father took me to a gymnasium in our neighborhood and was told by the principal that the school was 100% Nazi, and he could not assume the responsibility of the safety for his son, for me. That was basically a no. And at the time, there were 3 gymnasiums in Wiesbaden. The second one had some other excuse. The third one accepted me, and also my best friend, Leo, also Jewish. And we started the gymnasium, 2 Jewish boys in a class of about 35. What I remember of the early years at the gymnasium, the scholastic requirements were quite demanding. We started out with Latin and math and a whole group of other subjects. I learned to study, helped me later on. The teachers, we had different teachers for each subject. I forgot to mention that in elementary school, we only had 1 teacher for the whole 4 years. At the gymnasium, it became more specialized. And not only did we have high demands on academic subjects, but also in sports. This was now 1936, and the emphasis was to make good sportsmen out of us boys. Incidentally, the schools, both elementary and gymnasium, were not co-ed, were strictly boys. The girls had their own schools. And when I mentioned sports, we had 5 different subjects: gymnastics, swimming, track and field. And I know I needed to pass 5 different subjects in the area, but there too, I had no problem. As a matter of fact, there was a Jewish sports club for us children, where I was one of the members, so I always enjoyed the sports, and I could easily compete with my class fellows. Again, I don't remember any attacks or by other boys in the class. Leo and I sat together. We were not supposed to sit with the other kids. Socially, we were apart. After school, the other boys would be active in the Hitler Youth. Leo and I would be joining the Jewish social groups and sports that were provided by the Jewish community. As the years progressed, I'm now going from 1936 onward. It became more and more difficult for Jews to make a living, and immigration became much more an issue. But where could one go? Nobody wanted us. And to arrive, and you were not allowed anymore to take any money or any objects of value along. If you left Germany, yes, you could leave, but with no resources, no money to start a life wherever you would, whatever country you would go to. For a family to do that, to go somewhere where if you were admitted, you were not, often were not allowed to practice your business or your profession. You had no money. You did not know the language. You were a stranger, foreigner. Not an easy decision to expose yourself and your family to do that when you still had a somewhat tolerable life in the country which was your home and where you had lived in peace and in good and bad times with all the other citizens around you. So for me, life went on, school and activities and vacations. I always liked to go to relatives we had on the countryside. But in 1938, a relative in the United States in New York volunteered to say he did not, you had to, in order to get to the United States, you needed someone to sponsor you, to assume financial responsibility so you would not come here and become a public burden. Well, these relatives were willing not to take the family as such, but one of the children. So my sister, being the older one, she was 2 years older, in the summer of 1938, she was 14 years old, left for New York. My mother took her to Hamburg. In those days, one traveled by boat. I would have liked to go too, but there was no chance for me to do that. Anyhow, the summer of 1938, I still had a good vacation in Westphalia, where my relatives lived. Came back, and for me, life continued. Studies, sports, family, religious education, music lessons, and nothing seemed changed for me too much. I know that the family was realized that we had to leave. The business was supposed to be liquidated by the end of 1938. So the thought of not staying in Germany, but going somewhere else was something that was acceptable to me and that I knew that we would have to do and that I looked forward to. Anyhow, it was, for me, so-called normal times until one day in November of 1938. It was the 10th of November. Leo and I were in class, and around 10 o'clock in the morning, one of the administrators comes and says, "You two boys better go home. There's trouble in town." Well, we left. I came home. My mother and my grandmother, who lived with us, obviously upset. My father had left early in the morning to open the store. They were supposed to go there later. When they walked through the store, about 20 or 25-minute walk, they had to pass a synagogue, large building in the middle of town. It was in flames, it was burning. And they also noticed that some Jewish stores that they passed were being vandalized and destroyed. My father, who had opened the store, or had tried to, got to the store. It was a clothing business. It had quite a few large windows, displays, a lot of glass shelves and cabinets. And there was a large crowd in front of that store, busy smashing everything, breaking the glass windows, and destroying whatever they could inside the store. My father was told by 2 policemen to come with him. Not only on that day and the days that followed, were synagogues burned and Jewish stores destroyed, but all men at the age of between 16 and 60 were being arrested and sent to concentration camps. Well, the 2 policemen tried to, with my father in between, to get through the crowds in front of the store. The one policeman who walked behind my father said, "Go faster." The one in front, who had to create room for my father and the other policeman to follow, said, "Slow down." With all that crowd around him, my father managed to move sideways and disappear, and managed with a friend of his to escape to the mountains around Wiesbaden in hiding. Excuse me.
Call from 86620-39560. Call from 86620-39560.
Sorry about that. I went home. It was a difficult day for me to see the turmoil among the adults. Anyhow, Leo and I decided next day to go back to school. We were called to the principal's office. and were told that from now on, the school would not allow any Jewish students anymore. Well, we were 12 years old. A forced vacation is not the end of the world. So I went home. And what I spent the next couple of weeks doing was with my mother, we had to clean up the store. And I remember for days on end, gathering up broken glass. I still remember that sometimes at night I would wake up and I have the noise of broken glass in my ears. And the question is, what happened to the men? My father, after a couple of days of hiding, did come back because rumor had it that no more arrests were taking place. Well, that evening, after he had returned, the doorbell rings. We lived in an apartment. I opened the door. A man in civilian clothing identifies himself as a member of the secret police, the Gestapo, and asked my father to come with him. So within minutes, he is gone. My mother quickly sends me to some friends to warn them that the arrests are still going on. The next day, my mother and I go to the police, find out where's my father. No information available. After a few days, we find out that he had been sent to Dachau, a concentration camp, which gained much more notoriety at the end of World War II, when it was liberated by the American troops. What's happening in the concentration camp? We get news each day. One is worse than the other. I'm busy working, cleaning up the store. In between, we find out that a young cousin of mine, 21 years old, who was sent to the concentration camp in Buchenwald, that he supposedly had died there of a heart attack. Actually, we heard later, he was beaten to death by the guards for whatever reason, or no reason. Other families get similar news, and they fear what's happening to those in the camps is what everybody talks about, what everybody among us in the family and the Jewish community is worried about. One day, it says that some of the men are coming back, and they send me to the Central Railroad Station to see if my father is among them. I see a group of maybe 20 men getting off the train. My father's not among them, but I see these men after several weeks in the concentration camp, what they look like. I knew them. They had been business people, lawyers, doctors, middle-aged men of well established. Here they came, dirty, emaciated, in clothing, in rags almost. A shocking sight that I still see in front of me today. And of course, what everybody talking about, one has to get out of Germany. What happened during those days was the beginning of the end for Jews in Europe. Where to go? Nobody wanted you. And then we find out that some countries take children. Excuse me. England takes 10,000. My mother puts me on the list. My friend Leo has relatives in Holland. In early December, I bid him goodbye, jealous that I cannot go with him. My mother put me on the list for France. Here we had some relatives. And a few days later, we get a letter from a distant relative who was a teacher at a Jewish boarding school in Sweden, that Sweden was going to take 500 children, and that this boarding school was supposed to take 40 of the 500, and that this relative had put my name, so I would be one of the 40. A couple of days later, we get a letter from the Swedish embassy in Berlin, the capital of Germany, that they have a permit for me to come to Sweden. So automatically I'm removed from any of going to any of the other countries. And what happens about the same time, I was doing some work at the Jewish community. They tell me that my father had come back from Dachau after 4 weeks. I go home. By that time, he's cleaned up and pretty much the way I remembered him. He always was in good physical condition and somehow survived the hardship of 4 weeks at Dachau. Now, what do I have to do to get to Sweden? For England, that took 10,000. They had were organizing trains. For Sweden, we hadn't heard anything. My father found out that there was an honorary Swedish consul in one of the chemical factories outside of Wiesbaden. He was one of the German executives in that industrial enterprise. He received us very politely. And when my father said, what should one do? Does he know anything about children's transports to Sweden? The man, a high-level position, industrialist, said, don't wait. Get your son on a train, get him to Sweden. That was good advice. My father and I make a trip over Christmas to visit a relative for me to say goodbye. I remember Christmas Eve. I'm walking outside. This is a small village. My father and his 4 brothers all had gotten back from concentration camps. Their business or livelihoods had been destroyed. And all they can talk about is, where can one go? What should one do? I remember it was this village where I had spent so many vacations. It was my childhood paradise. Now was I felt now for me, it was the end of the world. I bid my relatives goodbye, gave back to Wiesbaden, spent a few more days packing. My personal belongings had to be packed under supervision of the police to make sure that I was not taking along of anything of value. On the 9th of January, exactly 2 months after the pogrom had started, I bid my family goodbye. And I just had my 13th birthday. I am on a train to Berlin alone, where I was met by another cousin who took me following day to the Swedish embassy to get my papers. There was still one incident, one little problem. When I didn't need a passport, but I needed what was called a children's identity card. And when my father was still in camp, took me to the police and to get this children's ID document. The official, not very nice, asked name. Then he asked for mother's name, and my mother said Baum. All of a sudden he became friendly. He said, "Are you a sister of Walter Baum?" "No, but I'm his cousin," my mother said. Walter Baum had been one of his, many years before, one of his friends in school. This Walter Baum had left for the United States during the 1920s, and this official wanted to know what we could tell him about it. I guess as a token of goodwill, he gave me then my ID card, but didn't stamp a big red J into it, standing for Jew, which all German documents that they issued for Jews now had to have. Well, the Swedish embassy was allowed to issue permits for children only for ID cards that had the J, so they would know that you were part of the 500 children that Sweden was taking in. Well, the mails operated very well in those days. You send it back within a few days. I have it now with a red J. I get my visum. On the 15th of January, I get on the train. It takes several hours through northern Germany to the Baltic. There, the train goes on a ferry. The ferry carries the train over to southern Sweden. Before we reach the Baltic, my documents in my little suitcase, my other luggage had been sent ahead of me, gets inspected by the border police, again, secret police. Someone had given me a book as a last farewell present. He checked it. He said, "You're not allowed to take any books." I couldn't care less. as long as I get out. We get to the Baltic. I see an ocean for the first time. Train gets on the ferry, and finally the ferry takes off on its 4-hour sea voyage to Sweden. It was a kind of a foggy January afternoon. I see the coastline of Germany slowly disappearing, and I felt tremendous relief, knowing that I was no longer in a country where it was a crime to be a Jew. I arrive at my destination in southern Sweden. I'm met by my relative. I'm taken to the boarding school where I spent the next year and a half. This was January 1939. In September, Germany invades Poland. World War II is starting. And my parents are still in Wiesbaden. In those days, we communicated by writing letters. And I write a letter every week, they do too. And this way, I stay in contact with them. When the war started in September that year, now all mail to a neutral country, Sweden was neutral, was being censored by the German authorities to make sure that nothing was written that somehow negatively would describe conditions in Germany or any other comments that the writer may make that was not considered appropriate by the Nazi censors. I still have some letters where a good portion of it is blacked out because apparently something was written that I was not supposed to read. I took those letters many years later to the police department here in Los Angeles that had a machine that could read what's written under in a document where the writing had been covered up. Well, it was not only covered up, it was wiped out chemically. The Germans were very slow when it came to these things. So I never find out what was the writer had intended to say. But those were minor concerns. With the war going on, by 1940, the countries surrounding Sweden, Denmark, Norway, by now are occupied by Germany. And the rest of Europe, with very few exceptions, is after the fall of France and Poland, is under Nazi occupation and control. Sweden was spared, and I lived there for 10 years. It was not, I stayed in contact with my parents until 1942, when Jews in Germany were being deported to ghettos and camps. In August of 1942, my parents write to me, it's now their turn, that they will have to leave and will be sent probably to Theresienstadt in what is now the Czech Republic, a ghetto town. And they indicated it might not be possible for them to stay in touch with me by mail, but suggested maybe that I could do it through the Red Cross. Well, I sent to them right away cards with return receipts, registered mail, separate cards to my father, to my mother, to my grandmother, and again, German. The Germans are very observant to international postal regulations. Within days, I get the confirmation, the return receipt with the names, their signatures, and their addresses. So now I know they're in Theresienstadt. They are allowed, I think, once a month to write 6 lines to me and to get letters from me and even some small packages. So I know where they are. But in January of 1943, after they had been in Theresienstadt for 5 months, my letters come back with a stamp left no longer at this address. I knew that that was bad news. I didn't know where they had been sent to, but I found out in due course that their final destination was Auschwitz, where they were murdered upon arrival. My grandmother stayed on in Theresienstadt and died there a year later. And what was considered a normal death, I guess it was starvation and sickness. That was the prevailing situation in Theresienstadt. I'm glad she died there because I know that she was scheduled not too long afterwards, also for transport to Auschwitz. We follow the war news. We listen to British broadcasts in 1940. We admire the fortitude, the courage of the British not to give up. And we watched the Nazis take on one country after the other. And in June of 1941, the Soviet Union. Again, they seemed to be victorious, but in December of 1941, they get stopped in front of Moscow, the first time that the Nazi armies run into insurmountable resistance. And on a Sunday evening, I was still in a children's home, no longer the one that I originally had arrived at, but now In 1940, I was sent with some of the kids to another children's home where I could start the Swedish high school and where I was a student for the following 2 years between 1940 and 42. Anyhow, one of the adults in December 7th, 1941, 10 o'clock at night, comes to our bedroom, 8 boys in bunk beds. Boys, Japan has attacked the United States. Now the United States is also in the war. The sense of relief, now Germany has to fight not only the British Empire, not only the vast Soviet Union, but also the endless resources and power of the United States. It gave us hope that ultimately Germany would lose the war and provide us with a chance for survival and regaining a normal life. I had 10 good years in Sweden, but decided in 1948 to come to the United States. I'm pretty soon after arrival, got to Los Angeles in late 1948. I have lived here for the last 70 plus years. I've lived a normal, successful, happy life. And I can look back and all I can say is, I was lucky. I was lucky that my parents had the courage, fortitude to send my sister and me out to another country, not knowing if they would ever see us again. I was lucky that I came to a neutral country, not to a European country like my friend Leo in Holland, whose last address also turned out to be Auschwitz. I was lucky that Hitler lost the war. It assured my survival. And I was lucky that I'm still healthy. I guess I have good genes. And I can look back on a time here in the United States, in Los Angeles, where I had many good, successful, and happy years. And now I would like to hear about some questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your story with us. We have a few questions from the people, students and teachers in the audience. The first question is, how many siblings did you have?
How many siblings?
Yes.
Just my sister and me. We were 2. And my sister got to the United States in 1938, and I joined her 10 years after 10 years in Sweden.
And when did your sister pass away?
About almost 20 years ago.
And let's see. When you were young living in Germany, if you, for example, went to the grocery store or park, how would you feel? How much anti-Semitism did you feel just from people in the city around you?
Uh, Relatively little. Uh, you see, I didn't look Jewish. I passed as Aryan by appearance, and there were, until November of 1938, I still could move pretty freely with my friends. We were active in Jewish organizations. Not only that, but we could go to the movies. I could go to the public swimming pool, to the theater to the extent I was able to. And I was, as I said, in a German school, not being harassed. I mean, I was known as being Jewish. I was very much aware of being Jewish. I did not have many social contacts or friends among non-Jewish boys, but I felt not limited as to personal freedom until November 38. I mean, after that, everything was closed for me. And those last 2 months were the period that is still very much, I remember that then any normality of life had stopped. But until then, there was very few incidents that I was maybe someone yelled at me, dirty Jew, or something. Was the exception rather than the rule.
And was it expensive to go to other countries, or what was the process? Was it um, to leave Germany and go somewhere else?
For me as a child, all we had to do buy the train tickets, which were, there was no special tax or anything like that. If you were an adult, you could not, and if you had any possessions or resources, those you had to leave behind. You could take the maximum amount of money you could take out from Germany as an immigrant, as a refugee, was a sum of 10 marks, the equivalent of, at that time, of $5. I know when I took the train from Berlin, there was a question, can a child take the 10 marks or not? So my cousin said, I had 10 marks on me, spend the money before you get to the border. And I remember I had something to eat in the dining car and bought some chocolates for the rest. And I left Germany with a total sum of, I guess, the equivalent of 10 cents, traveling to a foreign country, not knowing, which I knew nothing about. I didn't know the language, but it didn't bother me. I guess being young and anxious to get out, that for me I was not afraid.
the letters that that you had that you brought to the police department, did you ever find out what they said?
No, because it's uh, the sections of the letter that were blacked out were not covered. They were chemically, the ink was chemically wiped out. So, and the writers, unfortunately, were family that were murdered, and obviously I never would never know what it said, but it obviously must have, I could gather that they wrote about the conditions that they were facing, living conditions or hardships, or hopes for end to the war, anything that censor would consider undesirable for a recipient in a foreign country, in a neutral country, to read about.
Thank you, Paul. What was your relationship like with your sister after you came to the United States?
Well, we had been in contact, as I said before, in those days one wrote letters. We left as children. We met after 8 or 9 years, now as young adults. My sister had married short a year or two before I came out here. We established again family relationship. Yes, we had grown up under quite different circumstances. She in the United States, me in Sweden. So, but we again became a close family. I'm still very close with her children. She has 2 children, one son here in town and one daughter in a family in Sacramento. The son and I get together, not right now, but we are on the phone. So, and we were always together for special occasions, and it was normal, very enjoyable, good family relationship.
Thank you, Paul. And do you have kids?
I have one son. He lives in Buffalo, New York. He used to visit me here when it was possible. Last time in early March. He's married, has I have 2 grandchildren, 2 granddaughters, both young adults by now. And we were together quite often when traveling was possible or will be possible again.
Thank you. And did you also marry a survivor?
I married my wife, who passed away 3 years ago. I met her in that boarding school that I first came to in Sweden. We were children. And she left earlier, came to Stockholm. Her father was living there. I reconnected when I got to Stockholm in 1942. We were friends, and later on we started to date, and I guess I did not want to get married, not knowing that I would wind up in the United States without money, without profession. But I left it open. But she came to the United States and we got married pretty much upon my arrival. And we had a very happy and good marriage and family life. It's difficult now to be alone, but I manage. But I have many memories to think back on. We always cherished to be together and with family. Her siblings came here too. We traveled quite a bit, mostly to Europe. As a matter of fact, only last year was the last time that I spoke to a school in several schools again about my childhood during the Nazi era to German students now.
Thank you. We have a few other questions. So,
Yeah.
how easy was it for a Jewish person to make themselves look like an Aryan in Germany? Was it possible? Did it happen?
In those days, well, let me say this. At the gymnasium, we were 11 or 12-year-old boys. One lesson covered racial theory. The teacher had put up big pictures of Jews, ugly features, big noses, ears, much uglier than one could imagine. On the other side of the room, pictures of the ideal Nordic race, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, straight nose, and all that. So the teacher explained about the inferior Jewish race and the superior Nordic, Germanic, Aryan race. And then at the end, he said, yes, we have 2 Jewish boys in this class, and they don't look like those to the left. But keep in mind, boys, this is a lecture in theory. Well, the boys in the class in Wiesbaden, most of them were not blonde and blue-eyed and straight noses. I looked more like the Aryan ideal at that time. As a matter of fact, German students, when I spoke to them some years ago, asked me, how could a teacher teach such nonsense? Whereupon I said, the curriculum was given to him by the Department for Education, by the Nazi education. And the ideology, Nazi ideology, was to look down, to persecute, to exterminate Jews, and to create the world for the Aryans who should govern and rule over everybody else. And I told him if the teacher wouldn't have taught that, he would have been dismissed and possibly declared as an opponent of the government, with whatever consequences that included. To live in a totalitarian, single-minded dictatorship is something that is hard to imagine for those of you and those of today's German students who grew up in freedom, free to express themselves. But as I told the German students, this freedom also carries with it an obligation, a responsibility. And I wouldn't want to end my talk to whoever is listening to me today, to you young people. Don't take your freedom for granted. Be active in a democracy. Preserve the rights that you enjoy. And don't look down on other people, be they minorities, be they opponents, opposing sports team, the opposing class, never mind. Each human being has to be preserved and treasured. And my message to you, the kids of the 21st century, be tolerant, don't hate. I saw hate and intolerance in my childhood. I was lucky to escape. Too many of my childhood friends that I knew did not make it. Freedom is not something that's given to you. It's something that you have to work for and to preserve. That's the message I would like you to remember, and that you treasure the rights and freedom that you do have, and that you, I hope, never have to lose or defend.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. We have time for just about 2 more questions. And one of these questions is, do you know anybody, did you keep in touch with anybody either from your childhood or who survived with you?
Yes. I still have some friends. I mean, most of them are gone by now, but I have one fellow who lives here in town with whom I met in Sweden, who also came from Germany. As a matter of fact, many of the kids that I grew up with in Sweden, in these Jewish homes, they became friends for a lifetime. On our many travels to Sweden. We would be visiting them, those who stayed in Sweden, or they would come visit us. We met and kept in contact with many of them, some of them in England, quite a number of them in Israel. And that part of it was a very positive part of our life.
Thank you. And I know that you have gone back to your hometown on a few occasions, right?
Yes. I did it as early as when I was in Sweden in 1947. A brother of my father had survived. That's another story. But he said I should go to Wiesbaden, my first trip to Wiesbaden. I was at that time, 20, 21 years old. And I visited with a police officer the apartment where my family had lived. And it was quite a shocking experience to get to that apartment and to find the furniture, the cupboards, beds, rugs, tables, chairs, what have you, still the way I remembered it from 8 years before. But realizing that how it must have felt for my parents and grandmother 5 years before, in 1942, to be forced to depart to an unknown future, which they couldn't imagine how it ultimately would evolve. I found Wiesbaden at that time a foreign city. I found my way around streets, the buildings. The city was not as heavily destroyed as other German cities. But for me, it was a dead city. The people that I had left 8 years earlier, hoping to meet again, relatives, childhood friends, they were gone. Over the years, there came invitations by the city. There came contacts by the school where I was a student at one time, the gymnasium, trying to find out what happened to the Jewish students. That it took 50 years to develop that interest. It's part of history. The Germans didn't deal with their past until a new generation had grown up. But eventually, from the 1970s on, Germany, the new generation, was ready to face its history and try to cope with its past. I have been asked by German students when I tell my story, which I have done repeatedly in Germany, in Wiesbaden, and at the school where I was a student, they ask, are we guilty And I say, you are not guilty for what happened during the lifetime of your grandparents or great-grandparents. But you have an obligation to know the history of your country, to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And it's your responsibility to preserve the democracy and well-being and freedom that you currently enjoy. It's the same message that I gave to you a little while ago here. It's a different country. It's a different country.